So for any of you who have not been paying attention to the race Sweden has been trying to run ever since the end of, I guess, the Russian shtick of, oh no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. When the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, this broke the Swedish mentality of, well, you know, we can cooperate with NATO, but we don't need to be in NATO. We don't want to provoke the Russians, and we don't want to mess up the balance. We like this position of neutrality that it gives us on the international stage, as we can use it diplomatically to help settle conflicts, and it gives us some leverage. That ended almost immediately after the Russians invaded Ukraine. Now, when I say that ended, that doesn't mean on paper it ended, but psychologically, among the Swedish government, it ended in the months following the war. I can't give you an exact day. I mean, February 24th would be the most obvious conclusion, but the day of the invasion, we were debating if the SWIFT sanctions were going to go through. So the idea of Sweden necessarily joining NATO after the Russians invaded Ukraine, specifically, according to them, to stop NATO expansion, well, it seems that that front has failed. We didn't know immediately, but in the months that followed, it became clear. Now, Finland was also with Sweden and wanting to join NATO after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And while Finland also ran into trouble, they were able to join NATO last year. But Sweden was not. When Finland was admitted, originally the two states wanted to be admitted together. That's why they submitted their paperwork together. But only Finland got through. Now, this is for a few reasons, and I can't go through all of them, but I can tell you why Sweden NATO membership has been delayed for so long, and give you a few reasons. The first reason is that in Sweden, there is a significant Kurdish community, and within that Kurdish community, there are a lot of political dissidents that are not happy with the Turkish government due to their this is my view of it, brutal bombing campaign of northeastern Syria, which has killed a lot of Kurds, the militiamen that they armed, which pulled Kurdish politicians out of cars and shot them in the head on the side of the road in northeastern Syria, the bombing raids in Iraqi Kurdistan, which has been destructive to local villages, the years and years and years of fighting with the PKK in the mountainside, suppression of Kurdish dissidents in Turkey, historical racism against Kurds in Turkey. And so for that reason, there are a lot of Kurds that are not happy with the Turkish government. And in Sweden specifically, a lot of those Kurds are connected with dissidents in the region, and some of them might be even connected with militant groups in the region that both Turkey and the United States, like the PKK, considers a terrorist organization. And so Turkey wanted Sweden to give them concessions on, basically, to put it bluntly, corralling these people in order to please them. Now, they gave some concessions, not a lot of they gave some concessions, not all the concessions, enough to please the Turks, enough to piss off the Kurds, but not enough to abandon the Kurds completely in their country. They're not like, okay, fine, we're going to hand them all over. The Swedes changed the law so that those aiding and abetting terrorist organizations like the PKK, for example, by financing the shipping of guns, they can, it's going to make it a lot easier for the Swedes to go after them. So that's one area, and they were able to get past the Turks. Now, the Hungarians were the other big barrier, and originally they said that they would not be the last nation to agree to NATO membership for Sweden. That was a lie. That was not true. They were the last nation, and there was a lot of delay. Now, when it comes to the Hungarians and the Turks, and when you talk about Turkey and what they can contribute to NATO, they have quite a sizable armed forces. They have quite a navy. They have quite an air force. They spend a decent amount of their budget on the armed forces. They are militarily active, and they even do things that aren't necessarily in the interest of the majority of NATO states, including, for the example, leveraging of refugees. So, but if you look at the leverage and power they have, they are a net security producer. Now, whether they are producing that and they're spending it on NATO initiatives or stuff of interest to NATO, at the end of the day, they are spending that 2% threshold that people have been asking for. They were spending it before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they've been spending it after. Now, once you go to Hungary, no. Hungary is what you would call a security consumer. This is a nation state that does not have a gigantic armed forces, that does not have a mighty air force, that does not have nuclear weapons. They have to rely on the American nuclear umbrella. This is a landlocked country. whose budget is heavily reliant upon EU subsidies in order to function. It's part of the reason why the Hungarians have been fighting so much with the EU recently, is because they want those EU subsidies in order to keep the state afloat, in order to keep Viktor Orban's government afloat. In fact, the threat of stopping those completely and shooting down, basically executing investor confidence, was a lot of the leverage that was used by EU negotiators in order to get the Hungarians to concede when it came to the aid package to Ukraine. So Hungary, to me, as a nation state blocking Swedish membership, never made sense. There's no legitimate reason for the Hungarians to have been opposed to Swedish NATO membership. The Swedes contribute more. They have a more sizable armed forces. It's more professional. It's more well known. They have a decent air force, decent enough. They have a navy. They have a coastline, and a coastline that, by the way, is of import. If you look at, can we just look up the Lake NATO map? I wonder if it just comes up. Wait, is that an official Financial Times? Sweden joins NATO Lake on Moscow's doorstep. So this is now an official term. This is no longer a meme. Lake NATO is now the term that we're using for the Baltic Sea now. It's just, that's what the press is calling it too. Okay, got you. But this is Lake NATO, as people are referring to it. And it's now that Sweden has joined and Finland has joined, the entirety of the Baltic Sea, which this is an important area for naval warfare for the Russians. They have ports in St. Petersburg for a reason. They have ports in Kaliningrad for a reason. They wanted Kaliningrad originally after the Second World War for a reason. And so this right here contributes more, this geostrategically important location that the Swedes are, where they're not only hugging the Baltic Sea, but if the Russians wanted to get out of here and go out and say, go out to the Atlantic Ocean, they would have to hug the Swedish coastline. At least if they wanted to use this route, if they wanted to use the Russian fleet that's in this area. So whether we're talking about just the quality of the armed forces, the quality of the Air Force, the existence of a Navy, the existence of the Swedish coastline, their strategic location, the Swedes are 100% a security producer. NATO is stronger and not weaker by having Sweden as part of it. Sweden is much less of a liability than other states. Now, I'm not going to go around and pointing at other states which one's a liability. I think the whole alliance its unity is important, its strength is important. But again, out of all the states that could have ejected, Hungary was the last of the list. So why were the Hungarians blocking Swedish membership? Well, at the buzzer, their reason was, okay, well, we got to wait for the Hungarian parliament to come back into session and approve it. But in my opinion, it's the same old, same old. Viktor Orban wants financial concessions. He wants financial investment, and he's going to take every major issue that's of security concern to everybody else, everything that's of national security concern, so stuff that has to get through from a European defense planning mindset. So he's going to attach himself to all those initiatives and say, give me $5 billion, give me $10 billion, or I won't allow it through. And so holding these national security issues hostage in order to try to get more aid into Hungary. At least that's what he is attempting to do. That's what he tried to do with the aid to Ukraine. That's what he's tried to do before. And that's most likely what he's going to do in the future. Now, did it succeed really at all when it came to the Sweden case? Not that I'm aware of, but that's what I think that they were attempting to do. Anyway, Sweden is the 32nd NATO member state. It comes after the last NATO member state, Finland, has joined, right next to each other. This is probably the most significant contribution Sweden will be making, is its geostrategic location, and it has also been approving some recent aid packages to Ukraine. Another note that we should put forward is the Swedes also have the Gripen fighter jet, and I don't want to get into all the specifics of it, but it is being considered by the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians do want those jets to be sent over to Ukraine to supplement their air force. And that wasn't supposed to be something that they could actually go through and do until Sweden had joined NATO. And now that Sweden's in NATO, we're probably going to hear a lot more about those fighter jets possibly being sent over to Ukraine to supplement their air force. We could read this article, but the main thing I'm going to say that I think we should take from this is just that because Sweden joined, while of course this helps NATO, this of course helps them strategically when it comes to the Baltic Sea, this of course acts as I think, a lesson for nation states that engage in type of imperialist expansion, that if you engage in imperialist expansion against your neighbors will start to consider their security more closely in reference to you, and they will engage in some form of power balancing if they do not feel like they could hop on board with the conquest and cut a deal with you. And so the Swedes, understanding how deeply entrenched they are in the Western system already, were then pushed deeper into the Western system by the Russians. And so, I mean, there's an IR theory, I know, in the neo-realist school of thought, specifically defensive realism. Kenneth Waltz talked about this. This isn't just something that like liberals talk about in like the collective defense. Realists also acknowledge that this is a fact of life. And so, well, it depends on which realist you are. If you're John Mearsheimer, it might be a little different. But my point is that this is a direct result of the Russians invading Ukraine. Sweden would not be joining NATO, giving them Lake NATO, giving them that type of access to the Black Sea, giving them another security provider, not consumer, into the NATO alliance. This is Russia's direct fault. And in a time where NATO felt like it was going through an identity crisis, where it didn't know where it was going to be, what it was going to be doing in the 21st century. Is it going to be fighting the Russians? Is it just to keep stability? Is it going to be shifting to basically just, I don't know, like an extension of America influence? What is it going to be? The Russians gave it that inspiration. The Russians gave it that purpose, and then they inspired people to go join them. Again, I got to say this for the millionth time, if the purpose of the special operation was to stop NATO expansion, then on that basic level, it failed. It's already failed. Now, whether or not it can stop any more countries from joining NATO has yet to be seen. But already, the border that NATO had with Russia, just through Finland joining, had doubled. Now, one of the most important seas for the Russians from a geostrategic view has now just been completely surrounded on all sides by NATO countries. So, just a lesson that people will counterbalance against you once you engage in this type of behavior. Countries need to know their limits, and the Russians didn't figure out their own.